Welcome back to Rockstock Channel. Keith Coughlan, the Managing Director of European Metals Holdings, on the back of some very interesting news here that Cinovec, which we always said is the most strategic, largest, deposit in Europe, has actually been labeled that by, I guess, the European Commission. And also it looks like they're allocating significant funds to various projects, but it looks like, Cinovec might get 50 million euro. You need to apply for it still, but just talk about the press release that came out as a start. I want to talk about why your stock has not performed relative to some others. And we often see not every year the same companies perform the best, right? So those that haven't performed can prize, and illiquid shares can very easily, double or triple on news flow. So let's talk about first this news, and then Rodney and I'll ask questions about the rest.
Sure. Well, hi, Howard. Hi, Rodney. Good to be back chatting with you fellows. Yes, so we announced today that the project had been formally recognised as a strategic project under a European Union entity called the Just Transition Fund. And that's, as we say in the announcement, it's been approved by the European Commission, Czech central government, and also by the Czech regional government, the region in which the project operates. So that means that the project has been cleared to be able to formally apply for funding up to, as you said, approximately 50 million euros. The grant's actually in Czech, so it depends on the currency at the time. We can do that over the course of the coming year. It can be done in parts, and that's probably how we will do it. We'll probably apply for grants for specific parts of the early works development later in the year, and it's a very positive step.
Okay, so this Just Transition Fund, you were telling me that it's a $40 billion euro fund across Europe. You said the Czech Republic was allocated 1.64 billion of this, and 632 million of that euros are allocated to the Ústí region, and you're one of 11 projects in the Ústí region and the only mining project. Okay, so the Ústí region presumably is historically a coal region that are going to suffer from the energy transition. So this grant that you're expecting for Cinovec, UN CHES, is just part of that.
That's right. So the Just Transition Fund was set up specifically for that purpose, to assist European Union regions previously dependent on the coal economy to transition to green energy. And the Ústí region is very much like that. Our project's surrounded by historic coal pits, and there are still active coal operations going on in the region. So, as you shut down coal mines, it obviously has a negative impact on certain parts of the economy and the community. People out of work, for example. And so the EU recognised this, put together the Just Transition Fund to assist that transition. And, really the Cinovec project is a model for the JTF with regards to mining projects. So you mentioned, yes, 11 projects in the Ústí region have been approved. Others applied and were not approved. But importantly, Cinovec is the only mining and lithium processing project on that list.
It's not the only one in the Ústí region. Of the 40 billion that the European Commission has allocated for this, have there been any other mining projects that have been labeled strategic in other countries?
Not that I'm aware of, Howard. There may be, but not that I'm aware of.
And this grant, you were telling me, is, it's free money. It's directly to you. It's a little bit different than the grants that the US and Canada have given. We've talked with Piedmont Lithium about their grant, and E3 Lithium about the grant that they received. Those grants are kind of like matching grants. So for every $2 they spend, they then get, $1 back. But in this case, you're saying, no, this is money that once it's allocated to you, you haven't gotten it yet. And I want to understand, the application process and timing of that. But once you have it, you could use it instead of equity, for the early stage, site works and other long.
Yeah, that's correct. And those sorts of things are exactly what we would envisage making a specific application for when we get to that stage. So things like early stage works, site access, we already have a fully worked up decline plan in place, and that would qualify, would enable us to get access to the underground earlier than otherwise, which will be very handy for us in terms of dewatering and other factors, but also would help us with access roads to the portal, access roads to the lithium carbonate processing plant site, demolition at that site, earthworks, that sort of thing. But then as the project further develops, we can make application for assistance or for grants for other parts of the project as well. And as I say, that's up to a total of 50 million euros possible. It's you don't have to apply for all of it in one part. You can do it in a specific works fashion, as I just outlined.
Okay. Well, great. Well, congratulations for that. Let's talk about, we interviewed you on this channel in August of 2021. I can't believe, almost 18 months ago. Your stock was at $1.60. Rodney then we prepared an equity overview in January of last year. So Ches, in the midst of the pandemic in May of 2020, Ches took 51% of the Cinovec project and wrote a check for 29 million euro. That was meant to fully fund you to kind of like definitive feasibility study. I understood from our conversation earlier, there's now $10 million left, 10 million euro left at the joint venture. But separately, you raised at the EMH level. In February 2021, you raised 7 million Aussie at $1.10. And then last year, January 2022, you raised $14 million at $1.40, anchored by Ellerston Capital, a major fund in Sydney. And here we are, in the stock 67 cents. Last year, I don't know, we want to understand kind of the reasons for that, but I feel like Europe a lot, given the Russia-Ukraine war and the focus of Europe on energy security and a bunch of things, there seemed to be a bit of lagging broadly in Europe. As a European lithium story, you're not the only one that has not performed super well, but we've always thought that you're a strategic deposit. It's great that the EU is saying that. You are hard rock. It's not spodumene. It's a mica based a project with a head grade similar, I think, to what Thacker Pass and some other clay opportunities are from a lithium content perspective. But you've announced a number of things over the course of the year that Rodney will dig deeper into. There's been some changes to the flow sheet, but what's the path from here to, I guess, a final investment decision and getting this thing up and running? The backdrop, obviously, of lithium is much better. Prices are much higher. Commodity equities tend to follow commodity prices, but yours has gone the opposite way on very low liquidity. So I know there are a lot of viewers of this channel who are loyal EMH holders, patient. This has been a Ernest Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises. We've talked about a slowly then suddenly, thing. And hopefully this is a EMH's year, but for those who have been suffering and patient and trying to understand what's happening, here's an opportunity to describe last year or the last 18 months and why the next 6 to 18 months will be hopefully a lot better.
Sure. And you're right, we have underperformed and take that completely on the chin. Some of the factors I think have been external and some have been internal. We've definitely been slow with the DFS and the completion of that, and we will be able to update the market on that very shortly. We have an announcement on the DFS that's imminent, but there have been some macro factors, and not wishing to make excuses, but they do obviously have some effect on the way things have proceeded for us. You highlight an interesting point, and that is that Europe has been slow from a global point of view. And I think they've probably been the slowest, certainly the slowest of any of the major markets at embracing this. It is frustrating. There's been a lot of talk for almost 3 years now about the Green Deal and the commitment of €1 trillion to the green energy transition in Europe, then further formal statements of things like the Critical Raw Materials Act and these sorts of things. But actually seeing those macro statements convert to, micro outcomes, something on the ground and in reality has taken and is continuing to take quite a long time. And it is very frustrating. We've seen some of the mainstream European car manufacturers make big statements about what their aspirations are with regards to batteries and with regards to securing raw materials, but then not actually do much about that. And, all of those things just make it go by a lot slower for us. Hopefully with this JTF announcement now, the Just Transition Fund, and we're certainly seeing an increase in conversations in Brussels, which probably it was led by Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. That certainly the Europeans stood up and took notice of that. And we are seeing subtle changes in Brussels about, how this can actually now be deployed, turn into real boots on the ground action. That's the sort of thing we need in a project like Cinovec to be able to give confidence to the market of when we will get fully permitted, what will happen in the way of funding, and therefore, when we'll actually be able to deliver lithium into these European car makers and battery makers who so desperately need it. In terms of how I think that's going to pan out in 2023, how we're going to take this now through, the JTF announcement is a significant positive. It's not just the fact that there's potentially 50 million euros of grant money to assist us, 50 million euros that the project wouldn't have to find elsewhere. So that it's obviously less dilutionary to our equity holders, but it's also an endorsement of the project. One thing about the methodical way that the Europeans go about doing this is that it may take time, but when they do make a decision, that it's set in concrete. And so as Cinovec progresses and we do draw down on funds from the JTF successfully, I think it becomes a complete endorsement of the project in the eyes of the European Union and the various governments. And I think that's very, very important for us from the point of view of securing the project finance, which I think will be a significant positive for the project at that stage, and also just giving the market the confidence that the project is going ahead and it's going into production. Other factors that are going to come through into that, important factors, informing the market of when the DFS will be finally completed, which, as I say, it's imminent before we'll be able to do that. I do stress that the completion of the DFS is not the critical path item, it's the permitting. And the permitting process in Europe, in the Czech Republic, is what we might term slow if we're used to dealing in other jurisdictions, that perhaps have a more active mining industry. But we are seeing things improve on that front as well. Ches, our partner, is obviously very well versed in applying for permits in the Czech Republic for both building mines and also for building processing plants, or in their case, power plants. And they have already made some inroads. They've already managed to shorten some of the timelines that we were otherwise facing from a permitting point of view. But we are looking to continued macro changes in the region and in country to shorten up that permitting process and bring the project online as quickly as possible. We'll also, I've also mentioned to you and to others that we are looking at ways to significantly increase the annual production from Cinovec as well. It's a very, very large resource, over 7 million tonnes LCE, as you're aware, but the initial production profile is just under 30,000 tonnes per annum of battery-grade hydroxide and or carbonate. So we're looking at ways that we can significantly increase that. Clearly, the demand is there in Europe, and I think that's something that we'll also be able to inform the market on in a very short period of time.
Keith, just if I can interject there. So you mentioned the DFS and permitting. Let me just understand which of the feasibility studies will have the mine plan that you're looking to permit?
Well, the current feasibility study on the new flow sheet, Rodney, as announced in November.
So that's the one going forward for permitting?
Correct.
Okay, great. So then the DFS is just a refinement, but that's the one that's getting cleared. Yeah,
and that's been a part of the reason for what the market would see as a delay in us delivering the DFS. It became evident there was no point finishing the DFS on the original flow sheet. It had to be adapted to the current flow sheet because the current flow sheet is in so many ways significantly superior to that original flow sheet, from a number of different perspectives.
Okay, great. Keith, looking at the updated flow sheet, there seemed to be, it seems to have been simplified, and it seems to come with a number of ESG advantages. Can you fill us in on those?
Sure. So yeah, ESG advantages and obviously cost advantages. Rodney, less steps. As we announced, considerably less steps. All of the cooling circuits are no longer required, so that's helpful from a cost point of view, but also obviously from an ESG point of view. We've identified between 10 and 15 saving in both OPEX and CAPEX with the new flow sheet. But also, able to produce a very high purity material, both hydroxide and carbonate, and as also announced, the ability to produce a high quality lithium sulfate and a high quality lithium phosphate, both of which we think could become interesting, perhaps intermediary products as various markets develop.
Great. And just on that, when I looked at the latest presentation, it mentions the paste backfill, but it also tailings to be used to rehabilitate adjacent coal pits. That seems to be a new development.
So the cemented backfill won't utilize all of the tailings. I can't off the top of my head remember the number of years. I think it's 7 years. But thereafter, we will be depositing tailings into some of the local coal pits and helping to rehabilitate them along the way.
So that's a new thing. That's obviously helpful. It should kind of support permitting.
Yeah, well, certainly it is a positive from an ESG point of view. It's a further positive from a just transition fund point of view, if you like, as well. But yes, it should certainly assist with the permitting.
Again, just on the, looking back at the PFS, you used $17,000 a ton for hydroxide as a long-term price. If you look at Albemarle's recent presentation and, RK, what we've been saying for some time is it's highly improbable to have less than 20,000 as a long-term price just for incentives, and probably closer more to 25. If one were to bump up the feasibility study estimate, 50% to closer to sort of the 25,000, what's the gearing of that into your NPV and IRR, if you know that kind of off the top of your head? Well,
I do, but obviously you need to make assumptions on costs and what have you as well. We've seen inflation, particularly in Europe, but as I say, we've also identified some significant savings in the new flow sheet. So if we just said that those two things cancel out, which may be generous, but if we just use that number, at 25,000, I think that the post-tax MPV doubles from what we stated in January of last year. And I think the IRR goes post-tax to about 53%.
Okay, so nicely geared then to that pickup. And I guess, you've mentioned previously as well as in discussions on offtakes and so on, what you're allowed to publicly disclose, how are those coming on?
So our last big strategic meeting with our partners, chairs, was in adopting the new flow sheet back in November. And at that point in time, we flagged the next two key items for us to address from a project point of view was funding and offtake. I'm back in Prague, and specifically for that reason, we've got a couple of strategic meetings with our partners over the course of the next few weeks, and we believe it's time to accelerate discussions in both of these areas.
Okay, and what of course would be helpful in any discussion is having the flexibility of both carbonate and hydroxide. Is that still possible with the flow sheet?
It is, yes, absolutely. In fact, we can actually make hydroxide with the new flow sheet without having to go through carbonate, which is an interesting development as well. Most of the conversations we're having are still about lithium hydroxide, interestingly, in Europe, but I think having that flexibility is still very important. And that's why we also proved that we could produce a lithium sulfate of high purity and a lithium phosphate as well. As we see the LFP market advance, we may see, further interest in lithium phosphate, for example, as a precursor. And, there's already talk in Europe about significant companies that would like to buy lithium sulfate.
Okay, great. So, that opens up more doors. Good for you to have those discussions. The timing of the DFS, what's the sort of latest estimate on that?
We'll make a formal announcement on it very soon. I wouldn't like to preempt that announcement, Rodney, but the market will know that very soon.
I suppose with doing it all properly and going through the discussions, the start date, I guess those adjustments will come out as well then.
Yeah, and as I say, the overriding key to the timeline for the entire project is the permitting process. It's not the DFS, although obviously, we'd like to get that done as quickly as possible.
Sure.
But it's the permitting process, and we are spending a lot of time and a lot of effort on working through that and making it as short as possible. As I say, chairs clearly are well placed to be having those discussions, but also I feel that with an improvement in the macro within Europe, macro view on the need for Europe to develop its own critical raw materials, the now formal recognition of Cinovec as a strategic project, I'm hoping that these sort of macro factors may have a positive benefit for us on shortening some permitting timelines as well.
Given, the announcement at the start of our conversation, do you feel that Europe and the EU are finally ready to sort of push harder and push forward? They came out the gates early. Are you starting to feel now it's going to be backed up by aggressive action? I mean, I wouldn't say counter, but sort of match the IRA and so on in the US, that they now feel a greater sense of urgency?
I think that's the case, Rodney, and I think that's evident in a number of statements and speeches we've seen from various European Union, European Commission key people. And I think it was really the US announcement, the IRA, that made them sit up and take notice the most. A key trading partner for the EU, the world's largest economy, and someone who they pay a lot of attention to from a strategic point of view.
So Keith, just one other thing to mention just a bit on the delays. Last year, really like March 2022, was the first time you were able to travel again from Perth to talk face to face with your partners. And you've now been back, like 4 or 5 times?
Yeah.
Something like that. Like we've been in touch and you're always back and forth. I mean, there's much more dialogue. It is. But yeah, I think the Ukraine thing, definitely, there was momentum. And then it stopped, it slowed, because everyone was distracted with, energy prices and the whole other considerations. But the Inflation Reduction Act was only passed, what was it, late last year?
I think it was November.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a positive. Europe's getting with the program, you think, following the US, on a leveling of the playing field, point of view. There have been lots of announcements. I mean, I keep putting up this, Jerry Maguire, show me the money, because, I think there's just been a lot of stuff. And there are a couple of people on Twitter who are following this, super closely, that are constantly tagging me with, the most recent statement. And I'm like, okay, great. Just Europe's great at talking, but where's the money? And here we are, you're a step close to getting the money, but this announcement is not yet the money, but it's the gears of Europe move slowly because there's a lot of different countries, but they're moving in a direction of understanding they need localized supply, and you're a big deposit. And this project is strategic, and Ches is 70% owned by the government. And might you see, I forget which company it was, a French company, I think it was a French company last year, it was Aramet, who announced this $1 billion lithium project, out of converting, I forget exactly what it was now, but we talked about it. But this was far in this decade, it was at a scoping study level, but it was a big company basically saying, we've got lithium, why don't we hear from Ches ever about, in a public forum, how important this project is to their development?
Well, I think, Ches is a very large company, and this is, this is a small part of what they do as a company. They employ 35,000 people, and I think their market capitalization is about 25 billion Aussie. Ches has been very preoccupied with European energy security, as you can probably understand, for the last 12 months. They provide all of the power for the Czech Republic. So ensuring that the Czech people have heating over the winter has been Ches's primary consideration. I've been here to have meetings with senior people with Ches over the last year, and they've had to leave with a moment's notice to go to meetings at the ministry. They have been preoccupied, as frankly they need to have been, with the European energy crisis. But I can assure you the specific people we deal with at Ches, the specific people who are involved in Geomet, the subsidiary, the company that holds the licenses to the Cinovec project, completely engaged and completely committed to the development of this project, as we are.
Okay. So Keith, I was in Budapest over the break, and I passed by the Intercontinental Hotel and took a picture. And unfortunately, I will not be able to go back there at the end of March for Benchmark's kind of flagship European event. But they recently wrote that Hungary, there's major battery factories in Hungary, the Czech Republic, obviously with Skoda and Auto. But you're going to be there. This is the end of March. There's some momentum to. Hopefully there's some momentum to the European critical minerals, dynamic. But anyway, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I'm looking forward to attending that event very much. The last Benchmarks event I attended was in Perth late last year, and it was a very, very good one. Had a very high level group of companies and individuals attending. Benchmark do this space very well. So I will certainly be there, and Hungary's not a million miles away from the Czech Republic. We might even be able to take some of the delegates up to site before or after the conference.
I think that would be great. I mean, site visits definitely are back in the fore. Rodney and I have done a number of them last year, but yeah, there's a great opportunity. I don't know how close it is, but this underground deposit, it covers two countries, Germany and the Czech Republic, right? You told me you go down there and there's a border crossing.
There's the underground border at about 85 meters vertical. And you did ask me to elaborate a little on the history of the project, which I neglected to do. But Cinovec is a historic tin mine. Tin was mined here off and on for over 600 years, which is a very long history of mining, obviously. And there is a tourist mine on the German side, as you mentioned. You can go underground on the German side and walk about 300 meters to the Czech border. And as soon as you cross through that gate, you're in the Cinovec deposit. So I'm not sure in the US, but certainly in Australia, I don't think a lot of people appreciate the long history of mining in Europe, because clearly there's not been a lot of recent mining there other than things like coal, et cetera, but there is a long history, and it would be great to be a part of the movement to reinitiate that, to empower the green transition.
That sounds great. Well, thank you very much, Keith, for this update. Good to see early in the year, some good news. There hasn't been a ton of news flow. As we said before, I look at the scoreboard and you have 128 million Aussie market cap. I mean, for one of the most advanced projects in Europe, largest, strategic now, compared to some other projects out there, it's going to be a slowly and then suddenly, kind of stories. So there are overvalued companies on our scoreboard and there are deeply discounted ones. And I think, the negativity or what's reflected, what your stock price is reflecting is, I think one of the tweeters out there, Haplo, he's just like, what we have here is a failure to communicate. I forget which,
Cool Hand Luke.
It was that Cool Hand Luke. Okay. So there has been, it's been slow on news flow a bit. A lot of stocks sold off toward the end of last year and, not on a lot of volume. And a number of the stocks have come back because people said there's nothing wrong with that company. And they've just put in, bids and the stocks have kind of gone up. You've not had any news until now. And hopefully this news and this video and other marketing activity you're doing at Benchmark and elsewhere will get people to remember the value proposition here.
Well, look, this is not an isolated news, Howard. There will be other things to follow in the short term.
Very good. Well, looking forward to a great year. Our last video was called Piedmont's Year. I'd like to think it's also European Metals Holdings Year, strategic Cinovec. Good talking to you, Keith. Safe travels back to Perth, and look forward to talking with you again soon.